Right. All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT. Thank you for joining us for our Lunch and Learn today. We have with us Melissa Ostroff from Earthworks. And just to introduce Melissa a little bit, she is the Pennsylvaina Field Advocate at Earthworks, and she leverages optical gas imaging technology to respond to community concerns, inform policy, and ensure public health and environmental protection are prioritized across the state. And Melissa has a as a public health professional, Melissa is driven by critical need to hold industry and government accountable to communities and to scientific evidence. So thank you so much for joining us today, Melissa. And yeah, we're excited to learn more about oil and gas pollution in your backyard and kind of go through a little bit of the process of what you have been working on. And it's exciting because you came to visit us not too long ago.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, Jillian. And yeah, I'm glad we were able to do that field tour back in November, and I'm excited to come out again in the future to plan something else out.
Yeah, I can't believe it's been so long. I feel like it was just yesterday you were here, but when you
I
said,
know.
oh my gosh, it's been so long. But yeah, so we're going to go over a lot of topics today and present some information to y'all. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background about Earthworks, they're a nonprofit committing to protecting communities and the environment from the harms of oil and gas extraction, and they partner with communities to expose and respond to threats to public health and climate, often through the use of the optical gas imaging camera. And it says OGI. Is that the FLIR camera? Is that what people might know it better as?
Yeah, some people know it better as a FLIR camera. Technically, FLIR is the brand of the camera. I think there are maybe one or two other companies that also make this kind of camera, but FLIR also makes cameras that are not optical gas imaging cameras. So we try to be really specific, saying this is the type of camera we have. It's specifically designed for oil and gas pollution.
Nice. And so, Mary, if you wouldn't mind going to the next screen. Yeah, so do you want to talk a little bit about the camera?
Yeah, so this camera is really unique in that it can make what would normally be invisible, visible. And we like to say seeing is believing. Oil and gas pollution is the vast majority of the time invisible to the naked eye. You might smell it. In some cases, there is no smell to it, but this camera is designed so that you can see it. It looks kind of like a camcorder from the 1990s. So don't be fooled. It looks very low-tech, but this is a powerful tool. And we'll go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit more about how it works and the EPA's use for the camera. But this term, optical gas imaging, was actually created by the EPA back in 2006 when they made this particular technology lawful for use for oil and gas leak detection. So this camera, most of the time, it's not being used by nonprofits like Earthworks. It's actually being used by the industry itself to monitor leaks. And so the EPA has actually listed this as a type of technology that is lawful to use to look for leaks on site and to adhere to requirements for leak detection and repair. And as the Federal Register says, it makes visible emissions that otherwise would be invisible to the naked eye. And it's a really incredible instrument that we're very lucky to be able to have at Earthworks.
Yeah, so I find it fascinating, and I feel like oftentimes we do this in the work that we do using some of the same technologies that the oil and gas industry uses. So you're going out into the field and using this technology that an oil and gas company would have at their disposal to find the same things, to find leaks and detect things. So when you're going out into the community, can you tell me a little bit about what you look for?
Yeah, so if we're going to look at leaks that are on sites that are near the community, we're very careful, of course, to stay on public property. So we often have to go to kind of the side of the road to look at things. But there are a few areas where we typically tend to see emissions. When we're looking at, say, a tank battery, we often see venting that's coming from the top of the tank. So we'll look around the top of the tank area. If we are looking at maybe an older well, what might be called a low producing or low potential to emit well, they're often conventional wells. For those, we often have to look a little bit closer, more at like the casing around the wellhead, because the leaks that we see there tend to be from the equipment being old and kind of decaying, and so we'll see these kind of smaller leaks around there. And, for orphan and abandoned wells, which we'll talk more about later today, we're looking at the full gamut of, what might be on a particular property because it can come in all different shapes and sizes.
Nice. And could you tell us a little bit about what's up on the screen right now? We have a little.
Yeah, so this might look a little bit overwhelming, but, we don't have to go too much into the details here, but I will say it's really interesting to recognize that for humans, we actually only see a very small, very narrow band of light. What's visible to humans is in that spectrum that looks like a rainbow right there. It's 0.4 to 0.7 range. And when we're talking about this optical gas imaging camera, we're looking at a very different, what we would call mid-wave infrared spectrum of 3.2 to 3.4. So this camera is very specifically calibrated to look at oil and gas pollution. That's just the nature of it, is that it's right in that particular band. But if you're looking at all of the waves here, the wavelengths, you could be looking at X-rays, microwaves. Folks have heard of that, but what this camera looks at is a very different, very specific narrow band. And I see we have a question.
We do. We have our first question. Yeah. And anyone that has a question for Melissa during the presentation, go ahead and put it in the chat. Mary's monitoring the chat as well as I am on the back end. Mary's on the back end helping with tech. So thank you, Mary. And so this is a really great question. So something that I've been wondering too. Can you use it near facilities like the USX Clairton Coke Works? Does Earthworks offer a citizen science program? That's a great idea.
Yeah. So for the first question, I guess I have not used it there before. I would want to get a better sense of the type of emissions that we might see from the Coke Works. This camera can see methane. It can see volatile organic compounds. If the Coke Works is producing that type of pollution, it would be a good fit for it. There are other types of pollution that can come from different facilities, and the camera is not as suited to them. So I would be happy to follow up and potentially look into this site as a potential place to use the camera and see if it's a fit. In terms of the citizen science program, we definitely like to partner with communities in using this camera and provide as much information as we can. And so definitely interested in any potential partnerships and educating the public on this camera and on ways that you can monitor oil and gas pollution, again, in your own backyard. Even if you don't have this camera present, we do like to partner in whatever way we can.
Nice. Yeah. And this camera is super expensive. So just running our own citizen science monitoring program like we do with our air and our noise, it's super expensive to get the piece of equipment, which is like what is, I think, really most needed here to be able to see. It's such a unique piece of equipment, and I feel like you have like a unique set of skills, right? And you had some really important training that went into it. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what training you had to do in order to be able to run the camera?
So when I started in this role about a year ago, I participated in a training offered by the Infrared Training Institute. They have an optical gas imaging thermography training program where you get certified as an optical gas imaging camera technician. And so I was certified before I used the camera to make sure that I understand how to use it properly, how to interpret the videos that I'm capturing. It's a lot of information at once, but I think that it's something that if this were a more affordable tool, I think it's something that many community members could get trained in and be able to do on their own. The problem is the affordability of this thing, and Earthworks is only able to have these cameras through a grant program that we were very lucky to receive. And so in my role at Earthworks, I try to, as much as possible, go out to different communities and use this camera and, serve as sort of like a library. I could take it out and bring it to different places, but it's one of very few cameras that we actually have in the community and not in industry.
Yeah, yeah. And so so if Melanie, who asked that question, thank you so much, Melanie, if she wanted to and we probably, I'm not sure if we have your contact information on the last slide, but definitely
Yeah.
Melissa is the first step, and then Mary can also put some information in the chat here. It'd be great if we could connect you all, and there are a couple community groups actually working in the area as well. I know GASP. Patrick, who used to be on our team here, is now with GASP, and so we could connect you all if folks want to learn more about that. It looks like Melanie says that the mayor who works for USX Irvin Works is currently in charge of spending fine monies for other violations, and if she could gain access to those funds for a camera and to set it up, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Okay, great. And Mary had put your information in the chat. So
awesome.
Yeah, for sure. So that's great. Thank you so much, Melanie, for your questions. And so let's talk a little bit about what is in oil and gas pollution.
Yeah. So when we think about the components of oil and gas pollution, on the one hand, we have a good deal of methane, and that's a very climate harming component. It's 86 times worse for the climate than carbon dioxide over the short run. And of course, we're working on a very tight clock here with trying to reduce emissions and protect our climate. So methane is one great concern with the pollution. But then in addition to that, there are also health harming components. So often in the mix, you'll find benzene, ethyl benzene, formaldehyde, or hydrogen sulfide, and that's just to name a few. It does differ depending on one type of site to another, but there are health impacts here, of course, respiratory irritation, but also there are a good deal of studies that show poor birth outcomes for people that are exposed to this pollution when they're pregnant. Blood cancers, of course, are becoming a known health impact. And then more recently, a study out of Harvard showed lower life expectancy for folks who are living close to oil and gas pollution. And so we're concerned about this pollution both from a health perspective and a climate perspective. And when we're looking at it with the camera, unfortunately, one challenge is that we are not able to differentiate between, if we're what percent methane versus benzene versus another volatile organic compound we might be seeing there. But we do know that the camera, it can see methane and volatile organic compounds. And just to be clear about that last piece, we call them VOCs. Benzene and ethyl benzene are among those VOCs. And so when we're seeing pollution with the camera, most of the time, our understanding is that it's a mix of those things, but we know that it has to be in that category because the camera is fine-tuned to that narrow band.
Yeah, it's really tough because with VOCs, there's very few pieces of equipment that, short of doing a suma canister and sending
Right.
that actual grabs the sample of the air and sucks it into the canister, and then you take that to the lab to get it tested to see what's in that sample of air. There's really very few ways to be able to figure out, well, am I inhaling something that's a known carcinogen? You know,
Right.
am I,
Yeah.
you know, could that be impacting my health? So,
Yeah.
this is a great tool to be able to use to say, okay,
Yeah.
we know that something is present, something that we might not be able to see with our eyes, but we know
Yeah.
that it's there. And
Yeah.
if we go to the next slide, we can actually see. So this is
Yeah.
this is the one in our backyard, I believe. Is this
Yeah. Yeah.
this is the one we were,
Tonkin.
yeah. So this is a compressor station in Murraysville. We have been monitoring this compressor station for some time, actually a few years. And I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Earthworks came out. Um,
Yeah.
and right before that, one of the residents that lives across the street had said it's such a bad smell, and he
Yeah.
also said that it was very noisy. So we went out and did some monitoring equipment with our noise monitoring to monitor the noise, and I noticed how bad the air was. I physically got sick from being there for about a half an hour. And so we talked to the resident and asked them to call the DEP and report it. And actually, they did. And what we found out was that there were, I think, 7 leaks that were detected. So just from smelling, you can detect, right? That's a good way to
Yeah.
something. But
Yeah.
this reveals to us that, like, even years later, there are
Yeah. 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 It's frightening. Looking back at the video that was taken a few years ago, it looks very similar to what we found when we went there a few months ago. I know that when we were outside of this site on this particular day in November, we smelled something, and we were like, something's not right here. And then looking with the camera, we saw there was a significant amount of pollution venting off-site, though it wasn't quite clear where it was coming from. But, we're looking at a compressor station here, and typically with the camera, when we look at a compressor station, we're used to seeing a particular type of emissions that's coming from the compressor station itself. But this is like further down towards where there are some separators and there's pipelines connecting in. And it looked like something different and unusual and likely not a part of normal operations. And so, I submitted this video and filed a complaint on it. And when the DEP inspector went out to take a look at it, they said that on, the day that they went out, that this wasn't happening. And what they did say is that there was some work being done to connect a pipeline, like they're building out a pipeline there, trying to connect it to the compressor station. And so they had shut things off that day. And my take on it, looking at this now and understanding that they had shut off the pipeline to work on it, is that this looks like it could be a blowdown where, for safety reasons, they're trying to get all of this, all of the methane and, all the other constituents of the pollution out of the pipeline so they can work on it. But unfortunately, in that situation, while it may be protecting workers, it's really quite hazardous for residents that are living across the street. It just underscores the need to move away from this industry entirely, because you're in a lose-lose situation where no matter what you do, you're either impacting workers or residents.
Yeah, and I wonder if there, and maybe this is a conversation for another time, but I'm wondering if maybe, given this video, that, there could be some type of notification to the local residents, like when that happens.
Right.
I mean, that's something that's really simple for the company to do,
Right.
really kind of common sense.
Yeah.
And one
Absolutely.
Yeah, when we were looking through the camera, one thing that I was really shocked by, because you were like, "Oh yeah, we can see this plume," and I looked at it, I was thinking, that goes on for, like, you can see it for so far, like, it went so
Yeah,
far. I was shocked.
yeah,
Up
yeah, yeah.
so far. It's crazy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we could smell it very strongly, and I think
Mhm.
one or two of us got like a headache afterwards, just being like really right across the street in a residential area.
Mhm.
So it was definitely traveling far off site and into residence yards where they could be breathing it in, and we don't know for how long they were venting it like this, or really how frequently they're doing this as they're working on the pipeline connecting to the compressor station. But absolutely, the least they could do is alert residents when this is happening. That's the least they could do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. We have another one here. Can we talk a little bit about this one too?
Yeah, so this is actually taken in the Allegheny National Forest. And so on the left-hand side, you can see a tank battery there. It looks pretty old, not in great condition. But looking at it with the naked eye, of course, you don't see any pollution coming from it. But looking at the optical gas imaging footage on the right-hand side, you can see that from at least two of those tanks, maybe even the third one, but at least from two of them, you can see that it is consistently venting methane and volatile organic compounds into the air. We definitely smelled an odor again with this one, so I would say that's a really good note talking about the compressor station in Marysville as well as this. Even if you don't have an optical gas imaging camera, if you are smelling something, it's really, it is not supposed to be a part of standard operating, that you would be smelling something really strong like that. They may have a reason that they'll give you that on that particular day they were doing something, but most of the time you should not be smelling anything, any kind of strange odors near these sites. And if you are, it's a sign that something is likely off. And you can file a complaint with DEP with just that information, without an optical gas imaging video, but just letting them know that you smelled something. That alone is good information. And that's what clued us in for this one, that let's take a look at it with the camera because something does not smell right here. And this is among many, many older wells, older tank batteries in the Allegheny National Forest. A whole different area and different situation over there, but really disturbing to see the amount of pollution that's coming from these.
So it sounds like one of the first lines of defense would be your nose, right? If
Yeah,
you smell something, then there could definitely be something going on there where there's some type of
yeah,
emission. And then two, for the times that you can't smell something, there still might be something there. Um,
yeah,
and so this is a great example, two great examples of where you could smell and you could see with the imaging camera. So you mentioned a complaint to the DEP. So talk to
yeah,
me a little bit about that, and maybe that's something we're going to cover in another slide. And we also do have
yeah,
another question. I don't know
yeah.
which one we want to tackle first.
I'll talk a bit more about filing complaints to the DP in a later slide so we can talk through that more. Maybe we can answer the question now. I'm seeing, do you have monitors near the Beaver cracker plant? Who should residents near Beaver contact to get involved with monitoring there? So we do not have monitors at least Earthworks does not have monitors set up at the Beaver cracker plant. We definitely could look into coming out there on a field tour and like bringing the camera with me to take a look at it. There is a colleague of mine at Earthworks has been focusing on the cracker plant and on working with residents out there to try to get involved in monitoring the situation on the ground, even outside of the camera. And so I'd be happy to make a connection there. But I'm curious if Protect PT is involved in this at all too.
So we're not directly involved in the cracker plant because it is very far away from our
Yeah,
office area. However, we do know lots of people who are involved. So Barbara, you can
yeah,
get in touch with us and we can head you in the right direction. There's one there's an Eyes on Shell. I want to say it's a website where you can go and learn a lot about the operations there. That's one way. But Barbara, if you contact us after this, and Mary could put her email in the chat, we'll get you in touch with somebody, no problem, and we can. And I know that there are air monitors out there. I'm not sure if they're PM 2.5 or if they have VOCs also. VOC monitors have been really hard to get because of the
Yeah.
shortage of stuff like chips and all those things. And Melanie has another kind of question observation. I've also noticed that the release during heavy weather like snow, high winds, and rain can the camera distinguish during these times? I'm thinking that one of those times might be like a weather inversion that happens with and I definitely know that like with those weather inversions that any kind of pollution actually gets pushed down to the ground, so people could smell that worse. Can you maybe speak on that a little bit, Melissa?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and it speaks to some of the challenges with the camera. We are not able to capture good footage when it's snowing or raining. We really, unfortunately, cannot capture footage on those days. When it's windy, that's not a problem, but we have to be very careful about where we're positioning ourselves in relation to the winds. We want to be crosswind, so we're seeing the plume of pollution going across in front of us rather than being like directly in the plume and breathing it in, and also not being able to see it with the camera. So we have to be more careful on days when it's windy, but you can absolutely capture footage on those days. But when it's rainy or snowy, unfortunately, we're not able to capture good footage because of the precipitation interfering.
Yeah, and I did put in the chat. I'm gonna put this up here. We're moving our slide around. I did put in the chat. So we do have an air quality page on Protect PT's website, and there is a way. We have a great refrigerator magnet and a whole and a 2-pager that talks about how weather impacts air quality. So definitely, Melanie and others, go to that website, and you can actually request a magnet. We also have, and we could probably talk about this a little bit more later, but we also have some upcoming workshops where you can learn even more about air pollution. So tell us a little bit about how this ties into. So last month we had Kelsey Krebs from Sierra Club on. We were talking about plugging these abandoned wells. So tell us a little bit about how this kind of connects with that topic.
Yeah. So in thinking about oil and gas pollution in your backyard, one of the potential sources could be an orphan or abandoned well. And just to give a little background, Kelsey may have covered this, but for those who weren't able to watch that presentation, it can be kind of confusing with the terminology. An orphan well is an inactive well that no legal or financial owner can be found on the record. Some company at some point abandoned the well, they didn't plug it, and so the pollutants can keep coming out from it. But when DEP or anyone goes to try to figure out who's responsible for this and who should be responsible for plugging it, they're not able to find an owner on record. And that may be because the documentation is lacking, or maybe the company no longer exists. Some of these wells are very old. An abandoned well is left in the same state as an orphan well, so someone walked away from it, it's not plugged, at least in the cases that we're describing here, but there is an owner on record that can be found, but they just haven't plugged it maybe. And so thinking about oil and gas pollution in your backyard, these are a real possibility. If you're living in Southwest PA or even in Northwest PA, these wells are in parks, they're on residential properties. You can see in the image here, this is in someone's backyard in northwestern PA. This particular resident actually planted a garden around the well, and just, she's just doing the best that she can with it, and, basically making it into just like a statue in the garden. But she described to us that she'd been living there for over 4 decades, and when they first bought the property, there was a terrible stench coming from this thing. There were other pieces of equipment that had been like littered in the area. So they cleaned all of that up, and eventually she tried to plant flowers and plants around this, and they kept dying. And it's actually not surprising when you think about like methane. Actually, there are studies that show that methane can actually kill trees. And so, it's not surprising that the plants around there were not able to survive. But at a certain point, she just decided to plug this well with home insulation. So, I mean, it's crazy that it had to come to that. Obviously, she didn't drill this well,
Right.
but in order to just like make the best of it and stay on her own property here, she plugged it with home insulation. She said she still occasionally smells whiffs coming from it, but she's able to grow a garden around it. But this just shows that these are in people's backyards. They're all over the place. Companies have just left them. And so some people may not even realize what it is that they're looking at in their backyard, what this is. And so we'll show a few more pictures later that this can take different shapes and forms. But the vast majority of these wells are undocumented, so the DEP doesn't even know where they are, and that's why it's important for residents to report them.
So I think a big takeaway that I'm hearing here too is that like if you think that something, if you maybe smell something, but like this lady did, she planted a garden and it died. I know that
Yeah,
with pipelines, when pipelines leak, a lot of times like you'll see a bunch of dead grass.
yeah,
Because the leaking methane actually kills the grass. So I feel
right.
like that is also a nice, good visual indicator
Yeah,
that something
yeah,
might be going on, that there might be some leak there. So
yeah,
that is really good to note.
yeah.
And we also have, so Annie said in the chat that there is an upcoming Eyes on Shell meeting on April 6th. So thank you so much, Anais, for putting that in
Awesome.
the chat. And so, yeah, so that's great. And then we have another question. Okay, so how can you tell where a smell is coming from in order to make a complaint? Often smell a real stink in the air, usually at night or in
Hmm.
the early morning, and not, I guess, maybe not really sure where it's coming from.
Yeah, yeah. That's tricky. I guess with this question, I'm assuming that maybe there's a well pad that's there, but it's just unclear like what the source on that well pad, what the source of the smell might be, or where the leak could be coming from. And in that case, if you know the well pad itself is there, you can just file a complaint noting that there's a smell coming from that well pad. If you are noticing a smell that seems to be like oil and gas related, but you're not sure if there's a well pad in the area or where it would be coming from, that's trickier. And I would, I'd be happy to take a look into that and see if, like, looking at the DEP maps, if we can figure out what might be nearby, where it could be coming from. Of course, the best thing in that situation is if you have the camera on the ground and you can look around for it. And also happy to talk about trying to incorporate that into one of our trips if there's something specific. But I would file a complaint, even if you don't know exactly where it's coming from.
Yeah, and I want to say, if I remember correctly, there's some kind of like metering station or something. I just remember seeing this like almost like a fan in a box with like some pipes coming out of it. So maybe there's some type of infrastructure that's near where Pat is talking about.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
that we could look into to
yeah,
see exactly what's going on there, and
yeah,
and the next time Melissa comes out, we could take a look at it with the camera. It's a great idea.
yep, yeah, definitely would love to add that to the list.
So let's talk a little bit about the picture here. So and for folks that aren't able to see the picture, we've got just a picture of an unplugged well. And do you want to talk a little bit about what's going on?
Yeah, so we have an unplugged Orphan Well here, an optical gas imaging video on the right-hand side. And you can see, because it's not plugged, the methane and volatile organic compounds are just, just coming straight out from it without anything to stop it from getting into the air. And this is a really big concern, that because they're not properly plugged, we're just kind of letting this freely pollute the air, and with all of the health implications and climate implications that come from that. And in addition to polluting the air, there are, of course, other potential concerns with orphan and abandoned wells that are not plugged. There can be groundwater contamination with methane. There have been some cases of explosions. Because DEP and our state government in general is not aware of where the vast majority of these orphan and abandoned wells are, there could be situations where construction might be done right over top of it. And so, it's very important that we are identifying as many of these as possible, and making sure that they're dealt with as quickly as possible. And I'll talk a bit more about what's happening there on one of the next slides. But, one of the reasons that we're in this position right now is that there was no requirement to plug these wells until the 1980s in Pennsylvania. And prior to the 1950s, there weren't really many requirements to even document active wells. And so, there aren't really records for many of the wells that existed in the past. And today, bankruptcy is a common reason that wells go unplugged. And what Kelsey was talking about in the last Lunch and Learn bonding reform is meant to address that issue so that a company right from the get-go has to prove that they have the funding to take care of this well from cradle to grave, from when it's producing to when that's no longer usable for them, because part of the responsibility of drilling that well is also closing it off.
Yeah. And we have a really great question in the chat, something that I was also thinking about. So George asks, do injection wells or brine tank from fracking wells emit any detectable gases? I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. I think that they would. I have not, in my time at Earthworks, I have not yet gone out and looked at any, but based on the components of what is in the waste that's put into these injection wells, I would imagine that we would be able to detect with the camera pollution coming from those wells based on what's in there.
Yeah, and I guess it would be similar to the tank that we saw earlier, right?
Yeah.
Where they had, and I know, for instance, there is an injection well here in Allegheny County in Plum, PA, and I know residents have reported smelling like horrible smells coming from the tank, particularly when they vent the tank so the pressure releases to put more fluids in. And we actually have a VOC monitor out at the site as well, and we have seen a tremendous spike in VOCs that coincide with the smells that residents are smelling. So again, we've got smell, we've got some data that we could compare smells to, but it would be super if we could get some footage of exactly what's happening. But there are limitations to the camera, which I didn't know until the first time. So do you want to maybe talk a little bit about some of the limitations?
Yeah. I mean, because it is calibrated for this very narrow band of infrared light, it's not going to be able to see every single type of pollutant that might be coming from this. So we would really only be able to detect if there's methane that's being emitted or volatile organic compounds. But I think, like you said, Jillian, because we look at tanks all the time, which basically contain the same components that we would find in an injection well. We look at tanks and we see from the venting tanks, we can definitely see pollution using the cameras. I would imagine that if there are pollutants being emitted from injection wells, I would imagine we'd be able to see them as well. But there might be some components to it that we would not be able to see. There are some limitations to it for sure.
I also think that for me, one thing that I didn't realize the first time we went out with Earthworks was that there is a limitation on how close you need to be. You need to be really close to these sites in order to see some of these emissions. And unfortunately, with the one tank that we're talking about in Plum, you can't see it. But that might not be the case in Ohio.
Yeah, yeah,
That's where George is hailing from. So, George, maybe you could get in contact with Melissa and you guys
yeah,
go out. I know you guys have a lot of stuff, a lot of infrastructure out there. It'd be great if we could connect you two, and we could, you know, get some detection out there. So thanks so much
yeah,
for all the great questions. What a wonderful audience everyone is today.
yeah.
Thank you so much. So let's talk a little bit about the funding, this unprecedented funding we have right now.
Yeah. So this is a bright spot, at least for dealing with the orphan and abandoned wells that already exist today, that were left there from decades past. The recent infrastructure bill, federal infrastructure bill, allocated $104 million to plugging and identifying orphan and abandoned oil and gas wells in Pennsylvania. That's not like any amount we've ever seen in this state. And I believe Pennsylvania has the greatest share of orphan and abandoned oil and gas wells out of any state in the country. This is where the first oil well was drilled, right here in Pennsylvania, and probably not a coincidence that we have so many of these old orphan and abandoned wells. But with that funding, DEP has told us that they're hiring additional staff to identify, prioritize, and plug orphan and abandoned wells at a faster pace than they have ever before. They have a set criteria of how they are prioritizing which wells to plug first. Within that criteria, they are including wells that they find are leaking. They go out to the sites and inspect them to check for leaks. If a site is leaking, that gives it some points on their checklist. If it's close to the human population, if it's in someone's backyard, if it's next to a school in a densely populated area, that gives it some points. If there's some sort of structural damage to it that they're noting, that gives it some points. So they add all of this up and they total it and they put it in a spreadsheet, and that is how they are determining which wells they are plugging first. Something that Earthworks is advocating for is that close to people element, that element of, is it in somebody's backyard, is it next to a school, that is heavily weighted. We really believe that orphan and abandoned wells that people have been dealing with, like the resident whose picture I showed earlier in the presentation, that those wells should be prioritized. Maybe they have one or two fewer points than they might need to hit a certain threshold, but we need to prioritize those ones. And yeah, that's something I'm hoping that we can see. But we have an unprecedented amount of funding coming in for this. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see a good deal of these plugged over time, but there's a lot.
Yeah, so it sounds like PA has a lot of work to do.
Yeah,
let's talk about that a little bit more. Like, what do we see in these pictures right here?
Yeah, so you saw the abandoned well in that first picture in the backyard, which looked like almost like a landscaping, like a statue. It was more similar maybe to the photo on the left here, which really blends in. I mean, you might think this was a tree if you weren't looking closely enough on the left-hand side, but that is an abandoned well that has been left there, but there's more of the tubing that still exists on site, so it's taller than what you're seeing in the middle and on the right-hand side. So in that sense, it's more easy to identify, but given the growth around it, you could easily miss that and think it was a tree trunk. In the middle and on the right-hand side, you can see a different version of what an orphan or abandoned well might look like, and that's just, looking at ground level, you might see just a hole in the ground, or you might see there's some casing left like this, but it's pretty short. It might just be like a foot high, and so if there are tall grasses, it could be covered by that, or someone might just think, oh, it's just this random metal thing that's in my backyard. This, what does it even matter what it is? But if you've seen something like this in your yard and you're not sure what it is, it's quite possible, if you're living in southwestern PA or northwestern PA, quite possible this could be an orphan and abandoned well that DEP just has not identified yet. And we'll talk about how to report that.
Yeah, great. So if you go to the next slide, Mary, we can talk about how to report those things. We do have real quick another. I think this is more of a comment. Health risks from benzene exposure have been shown to be greater for people who live within 3 miles of a point source of emissions. We should demand that much setback for wells. I wholeheartedly agree, Barbara.
Yeah.
Sure. The more distance we have, the more protection we have.
Absolutely, yeah. And put a plug in here for our Setbacks Coalition, our Protective Buffers PA Coalition, because we are fighting for exactly that. It's very important to have as much distance as possible from this stuff.
For sure. So how do we report? This goes to my question earlier. How do we report these things when we find them?
Yeah. So for now, for orphan and abandoned wells, you would report them in the same way that you would file any other complaint with DEP. So they have a website here, which is a very long, very difficult to remember website. If you can't copy and paste this, which is probably tricky since it's on YouTube, the best bet is honestly to just Google PADP environmental complaints. It'll come up more quickly that way. But they have several regional offices, so the complaint goes to that regional office. You could call the number for the regional office. Those are available on the website if that's more accessible for you to call it in. Or you could submit the complaint via the online form. And they are sending out inspectors to look at these sites and to add them to their list. And so I would say the sooner that you can file a complaint with them, the sooner someone can come out and take a look at the site and add it to the list and prioritize it, give it those points based on the criteria that they have, and the more ability we have to hold them accountable to plugging those wells. But yeah, this would be the same at the moment as any other DEP complaint that you would file using that incident report page. But in the future, DEP has said that they will have a specific online forum for orphan and abandoned wells, and they might even create an app. But we'll see if that happens.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, and speaking of apps, Mary, oh, thank you. So we also have a reporting tool, and this will take you to the complaint form for DEP, and as well as other, depending on what you see, or smell or hear, other things, other resources. So we have a reporting app, and it's not just for our area of Westmoreland or Allegheny County. It can be used anywhere in Pennsylvania right now. And actually, there are folks that are working on expanding an app like this to work in other parts of the country as well. But it's really easy to remember. It's just report.protectpt.org. So it's you don't have to download it from the App Store or anything. It's just a responsive website that gives you some questions to answer on what you see, smell, hear, maybe be feeling health-wise. And you go through a list of questions, and it shares the data with us. If we're not working the area, we'll share it with somebody else that is. But at the end of the questionnaire, there are lots of resources. So what we do is, based on the information you have given us on where you are, we will give you the information of the DEP. The phone number will give you, you can click a button and go right to this form, so you don't have to know the website. You just go right to the form by clicking a button. If it's something else that's not related to air, if it's like a spill or something like that, there's other agencies that we've listed there that are really good to call, in case of those types of things. So definitely check out the report.protectpt.org app. And it's really easy to use. You can use it on any device. You don't have to have a smartphone. If you have a tablet, if you have just a desktop computer, no problem. It doesn't matter. And so if we go ahead to the next screen, PK says, thanks, Earthworks and Protect PT. We thank you guys for joining us today too. I'm going to go ahead and put the link to that that portal also in our chat. And I'm not sure if we even need the portal.php that's on here. It's just the report.protectpt.org. And so, if people want Melissa to come to their neck of the woods and check for those leaks, so this is how we contact you. So, Melissa, if somebody contacts you, what should they do to prepare for your visit?
Yeah, I'd say if we are looking to do a visit and to visit a specific site, as much information as they can give us on like the specific location of that site. So if they have GPS coordinates, they can give us an intersection. If they can let us know how close we're able to get to the site while staying on public property, perhaps they might know or be friendly with a resident who has a site on their property that might let us have access to it. As much as they can tell us about accessibility to the site and how close we can get, so we can plan that out. And then any specifics they can provide on what they've noted there, have they smelled anything, have there been previous complaints at the site, any specific concerns about the types of emissions that might have been present there. That'll help us to plan out a visit. And yeah, I'm happy to incorporate additional sites that community members are concerned about into the trips that we do out to southwestern PA and other parts of the state. I know that together with Kelsey, with Sierra Club, and other groups, we are going to be planning some tours with the camera to take a look at orphan and abandoned wells. And so I'd love to tack on to those trips some additional sites that folks would like looked at.
Yeah, that sounds great. Can you still hear me okay? I switched off the audio on the one
Yep.
for my notifications. And we are very, very lucky today to have so many wonderful people joining us, and thank you all so much for the questions. It's important to us that we bring content to you that's really relevant and that will help you and your community to be safer. And so please take just a minute to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you know when the upcoming broadcasts are coming. Also, you can follow us on Facebook as well. We sometimes do post on Facebook too. And then finally, the most important thing is to take our survey, because that will tell us what you think of our broadcast as well as what you might want to see in the future, because we want to make sure we're bringing you different content as well that's relevant to your community. So please do that. I'm going to go ahead and click this off so folks can see the survey link. And if we want to go ahead to the next screen, so next month is actually Protect PT's 7th anniversary, which is kind of crazy to think about. But 7 years of working in our community. And so April 26th, which is the day before our 7th anniversary, we're going to have a lunch and learn to talk about what we have accomplished in that 7 years, and talk a little bit about what we plan to do for the future. And we have some really exciting things coming up in the future. It's really exciting to be a part of this organization and work with these wonderful people you see in some of the pictures here. Yeah, and to be able to bring content like this to everyone out here, and to be able to share the wonderful work that Melissa and her team does at Earthworks to help protect us as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Melissa. I was so happy that you were able to share this with us. We have been planning this for a long time, since before November, since before you came out in November. So I'm really happy we were able to kind of wrap up our whole health and safety tour of Westmoreland County and Allegheny County, and be able to get that imaging, do those and document those complaints to the DEP that we were able to do, get some result there, and then finally be able to tell our story to other people. So thank you so much for all the work that you guys do. And I really hope we see you again in our community, and we'll get you connected with folks on the call today.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me. And I'm also so glad I was able to come out there in November and looking forward to coming out again in the near future. Very excited for that.
And thank you, everyone, for your wonderful questions and that informed this discussion today. So have a great day, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed our Lunch and Learn. Take care.